Good Thursday, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I know we've got the weekend ahead of us. I know there's some that are going to be off to Maywood next week, and they're looking forward to that. Certainly, we want to pray for the efforts there, and that much good will come out of it. I'll give a couple minutes, or really give you about a minute for people to come in. I know sometimes the way that it starts, there might be a little bit of a delay, and it may take some people about a minute or so to try to get in and to start from the beginning. I will go ahead and say that if you're thinking about next week, the parables that we'll talk about, look in your Bibles, Matthew chapter 13. I've got my Bible out in front of me. I hope you do too, as we're about to study the three parables tonight. But Matthew chapter 13, we're going to finish out the parables in this chapter next week. So Matthew 13, the parable of the hidden treasure, the parable of the pearl of great price, and the parable of the dragnet is what we're going to look at next week. Again, this is Thursday in the parables. Hopefully you've read Matthew 13, 24 through 43. If you haven't, you can stop here, come back and watch us later, and go back and read that passage before we get to it, because again, we don't have time to look at each verse individually. But again, I hope you're doing well. Let's go ahead and begin our study tonight. First of all, we're going to talk about the parable of the wheat and tares. Secondly, we'll talk about the parable of the mustard seed, and then third, we'll talk about the parable of the leaven. But tonight we want to begin talking about Matthew chapter 13, the wheat and the tares. Again, as we talked about last week, we sort of want to begin by again talking about the background, as we do for all parables, where we're at in Jesus' life. You know, Matthew chapter 13, we left off there last week, and it might be helpful for us to think about the differences in the compilation of the gospel accounts. And what I mean by that is how they're organized. I didn't really realize this until several months ago as you're going through the accounts of the gospel, but they are arranged a little bit differently. For instance, Mark and Luke, for instance, are more so focused on keeping things in chronological order. Whereas for, say, Matthew's more sort of divided up by theme, and that's the main purpose and organization behind how Matthew structures his account of the gospel. And then, of course, you have the Gospel of John that's a little bit different than the other three, because it's not a part of the synoptic gospels, and what that just simply means is that there are a lot of parallel accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as you see with the parables, that John doesn't have. That's not to say that the Gospel of John is lesser than those three. It's just that it's a little bit different in how it's organized and the accounts of Jesus' life that are contained within it. So when we think about the differences in how they're compiled, the reason why we're focusing maybe more so on Matthew's account tonight is he does his a lot by theme. And if you think about what we talked about last week, Matthew chapter 13, we in a way can look at these parables as continuing some of the same thoughts as what was conveyed in the parable of the sower. And in particular, we think about what do we do with the knowledge of the fact that there are different soils? And maybe that's the question that serves as our main point of consideration as we move forward. Last week we talked about how there are different soils. People respond differently to the gospel. Some obey it, some obey it but then leave for whatever reason, and some just outright reject it. And so when we're thinking about the first parable tonight, the parable of the wheat and tares, we might think about that in the case of what do we do with the knowledge that people are going to react differently. Because the parable of the wheat and tares, in a way, kind of deals with that point. So let's go ahead and look at the text. So if you've read the text, you sort of know what happens. Again, Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 and 25. We read about a man who goes out into his field and he sows good seed. He does this openly. In verse 25, Jesus tells us that there's another man that comes in while the men of the field are asleep, and he sows in tares among the wheat. And he does this deceptively, without the permission or without the knowledge of approval given to him to do that. And so what we want to do is to go ahead and connect that to what it means. This is one of the parables where Jesus does explain what he means in the parable. The disciples ask him later on, beginning down in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 36. So we do want to go ahead and note what it means. Jesus says that in Matthew 13, verse 38, that the field being sown in verses 24 and 25, it represents the world. And that's important to note. It does not represent the church, but it does represent the world. Some people have made the mistake of assuming that that is the field, but Jesus is very clear here. He's talking about the seed being sown in the field. We know that the seed itself is the gospel. We go back last week talking about the parable of the sower. The seed is the gospel. As Jesus says, the sower of good seed, verse 37, that's Jesus himself. The one who comes in and is the deceptive sower is Satan. Matthew chapter 13, verse 39 clearly states that it's the devil who comes in and sows the tares. And so you're thinking about the crop itself and why it takes so long to spring forth. That might be a natural question we might ask. The idea of sowing in tares among good crops was actually something familiar to the culture of Palestine and the Middle East in that day. In fact, you can go back to look at some ancient texts that trace back to the 1st century before Christ and the 1st century after Christ that are influenced by Jewish and Christian writers. These are not inspired, but they are historical records, and they mention the fact of how there was one occasion, I believe, when I'm not sure if the Jews were leaving a particular place, but one of the punishments towards them was that a group of people came in and sowed tares in their fields. And you think about what the tare itself is. We'll talk about that in a moment, but it's destructive. The tare itself, what some writers have said is that if you eat it, you get sick. It's considered poisonous, and so you don't want to eat it. You know, we eat wheat, or we use wheat to make grain into bread and into things like that, but tares are dangerous. The Romans actually passed a law that forbid anyone going into another person's field just to sow tares, which probably indicates how prevalent this was, and maybe was a way of getting revenge on someone in that way. So this is a common practice. The thought of this is common in that day. And so we might think to ourselves, why wait so long? Why would you wait? Verse 26 talks about the fact that the blade had completely grown up before they're going to do anything about it. Why are they waiting so long? Why didn't they just go in and take out the seed to begin with? Well, one, of course, is the fact that as we see that the wheat and tares they look very similar. And what you have is a picture of a man that's in a field. And what that's supposed to illustrate and what's being depicted there is a man that's in a field that is filled with both wheat and tares. Tares are a type of weed, but they look very similar to wheat. And it was very hard to tell and to distinguish between the two as they're growing up. But the next picture that you see is sort of the end result of it. You can tell a little bit of difference between the wheat and the tare. It can be a little bit hard if you're from far away. But at least right off the bat, as the crop is growing, it would be very hard to differentiate between the wheat and the tares. And so that in part explains why they wait till that moment to get rid of it. And so we move on. They notice the tares are there among the wheat. And then the conversation there between the householder and his servants. Matthew 13, verse 27 through 30. As the householder who represents Jesus tells his servants, it wasn't Jesus that had sown the poor seed, but it was the devil. And again, the good crop itself, it represents Christians. The bad crop, and I don't have that on there, but the bad crop represents the children of the devil, or those that are of the world. It goes back to Matthew 13, verse 38. And so instead of taking care of it right then, the householder who represents Jesus again, it says that there's going to come a time of separation for the harvest. Verses 28 through 30, that's when the wheat and the tares are going to be separated from themselves, or separated and put into separate groups. One's going to face destruction, the other one's going to face salvation or be a productive crop. And Jesus reiterates that point when he's explaining this to the disciples in Matthew 13, verse 40, that those who are of the tares, those who are of the children of the devil, will at some point when judgment comes, face eternal punishment for their wicked deeds. And that, again, is reiterated in verse 30 and in verses 42 through 43. Again, the idea that the tares will face destruction, the wheat will face salvation. The tares, again, being the children of the world, the wheat being the children of God. All right, and so we want to think about application for a moment and think back to what we began with talking about the background. We keep in mind the parable of the sower, and it brings up the point to us that the righteous and the wicked will always exist on the earth. That is something that is held true for really the test of time, ever since the Garden of Eden when man sinned. You know, Ezekiel says this in Ezekiel 7:15. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There's a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. And the point being is that you think that in terms of judgment, you think when the wicked would be punished immediately, the righteous would be rewarded immediately. And so that separation would necessarily happen on earth. That would be the conclusion of some. Well, the writer of Ecclesiastes says that that's not always the case. Sometimes the righteous are punished in this life or face punishment in life. Sometimes the wicked prosper in their wickedness. And so the righteous and the wicked will always exist really up until the day of judgment. Jesus is trying to, again, reiterate that message into the minds of his apostles and his disciples. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we don't fight against wickedness. That means that doesn't mean that we don't fight against sin. Some people might have the mindset that, you know, just because these are things that will always be, that we don't need to do anything in response to them, which is not the case. We as Christians, Ephesians chapter 6, we always have should always be seeking and always understand that we constantly have to be warring against Satan and wickedness. Not that we, in the sense of fighting against sin, rather than doing punishment to the individual. And so we want to move on to the next point of application we could make from this. And that's the idea that we need to focus more on the sowing and not necessarily on the separating. And you think about what Jesus' disciples have heard. You know, not everybody's going to obey the gospel. There are going to be some people that are going to be persecutors of the church. They are the tares. They are going to call themselves the children of God. You know, later on the Jews would continue to hold to that even during the Christian dispensation in the first century, talking about the persecution of the Jews and the Christians, of the Christians there in the first century. And so for a lot of them, they could have been focused on, you know, they could have been focused on getting retribution towards those that were wicked. Just like the people there in the parable, the servants recognized that the tares were evil, that they need to be completely done away with immediately. The householder, which represents Jesus, says, well, wait until the time of harvest. Or in other words, for us, you know, in terms of dealing with those that are wicked, those that persecute the church, let God handle that later on in terms of the judgment. And so that might be a point we want to keep in mind. Focus more on the sowing and not on the separating, because God ultimately does that in the day of judgment. We have a couple passages to look at. Ecclesiastes 11 verse 4. Solomon says, he that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. And what he's pointing out there is that if we're so focused on the conditions around planting and not the actual act of planting itself, we could come up with any reason to not plant because we're worried about some other thing, and our mind's not focused on sowing. Well, as Solomon's saying there, you can't have hope of having a crop if you never sow to begin with. And the same thing is sort of pointed out in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and chapter 3. You keep in mind, Paul's writing to a group of Christians that have struggled with persecution, and you see that come forth in Acts chapter 17, where Paul faced persecution in Thessalonica. And in chapter 1, verses 7 through 9, Paul talks about what's going to come to those that persecute Christians, judgment. And they keep that in mind, but when you go to chapter 3, you realize that there are several Christians there in Thessalonica that had stopped working, that they were looking towards the second coming of Christ, and the persecution or the punishment of the wicked, they were looking so much forward to that they had completely stopped working, not just physically but spiritually working. And in a very clear and real sense, they had forgotten to sow. They weren't focused on sowing. They were more concerned about how God was going to separate the wheat and the tares from each other. And so that's always a good point to keep in mind when looking at this parable. And then finally, we keep in mind that God is the ultimate judge for a reason. And Jeremiah sums this up very well concerning the heart. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I try the reins, even to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. It may, again, like that parable indicates, it can be hard to differentiate between the wheat and the tares, to differ and to show the differences between the two. But because God knows the hearts of individuals, that's why you want him to be the one who's the judge on Judgment Day and not us, because he knows the heart of individuals and can respond appropriately to that by giving the proper reward or punishment based on the individual. And that's what Jesus is reminding his disciples, whereas they might be like we might think about how the Jews wanted to drive the Romans out, to drive their persecutors out, and they were so focused on that they forgot about the Word of God. Jesus didn't want the same thing happen to his disciples. Don't focus on so much of the wicked. Don't focus so much on the getting rid of the wicked that you forget about planting the Word of God in the hearts of men. And that's just a simple thought to keep in mind. The more that we continue to sow the seed and the more time that we spend sowing the seed, the less area, the less room that the devil has to sow his seed, to sow the tares, we might could say, in the hearts of men, if we do our jobs appropriately. And so now we want to move on to the parable of the mustard seed, which Matthew chapter 13 follows along through. I've got in the bottom of the video, you can see the text there, and some of those overlap here. But let's talk about the parable of the mustard seed. These two are very short, so it won't take us that much time. Again, we think about that it parallels with Mark 4, verses 30 through 32, and Luke 13, 18, and 19. Sometimes the parables do this. They don't always do this, but this is one of the cases where the parables do overlap. So we look at the parable itself, and it's very short, but we don't have a specific explanation given to us like we did with the sower and the wheat and the tares. Again, we see that the mustard seed is sown. One of the things that you note about it is very small. The writer points that out. I looked up some stuff about this, some extra details about this, and what I found is that the mustard seed, at least what they presume the specific mustard seed that Jesus is talking about, is probably somewhere in the scope of 1 millimeter in diameter. It takes about 750 just to equal 1 gram. And to translate that into how Americans use weight, that would be 1/28 of an ounce. So you multiply 28 times 750, and I can't tell you what that is. I'm not that great at math. Certainly can't do that off the top of my head. But 750 times 28, whatever that number is, that's about how many of those seeds it takes to equal 1 ounce. So they're very small. The seed itself, again, represents the gospel. And it's trying to emphasize, this parable is trying to emphasize even though the church has a small beginning, that doesn't mean that it won't produce great results. Again, there we go. Again, we think about the book of Acts. We think about how the kingdom grows throughout the book of Acts. It begins in Jerusalem, and really only 3,000 people, we say only, that sounds like a lot. But if you think about how many Jews would have been there to observe the Feast of Pentecost and the celebrations associated with it, 3,000 people wasn't a whole lot of people in comparison to the number of Jews and those of other regions that would have been in the city at that point. But yet throughout the book of Acts, you see the church continually growing. It goes from Jerusalem, it goes all the way to Judea and Samaria because of persecution. You see more people obeying the gospel. You see Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey going into Asia Minor to take the gospel. You later see Paul and Silas go on 2 other missionary journeys to take the gospel to Greece and then ultimately to Rome, which at that point was considered the center of the known world. And it ultimately, you see the progression of the church and it growing. And you keep in mind what Daniel said about it, Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, talking about the time of the church, saying, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. But it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And that kingdom being great, not because it's a political kingdom, but because it transcends political kingdoms. People from all different nations can be a part of that one kingdom. And in that way, as Matthew 13 verse 32 says, even if it is a small seed, it grows and it becomes the greatest among herbs, is what Matthew records for us. And so we come to the end of that verse, and there's some people that would maybe bring up, this question about what do the birds represent, or what do they mean in here? Some would say that the birds represent those false teachers that would creep into the church. That's been one view of that. I don't necessarily hold to that view. Certainly we do our own studying, but you think about it in the context of what he's talking about, the expansion of the church. It could also indicate that it's talking about the refuge to so many people that's provided in the church. And you think about Jesus' statements, Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. I know Brother Wayne talked about this. It's either in Bible class or maybe in a sermon a couple Sundays ago, talking about that it's through Jesus that we have rest and refuge. And Jesus told his disciples, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Well, that rest would be in the church. Think about Ephesians chapter 2. Paul's talking to those that were aliens from the covenant, of strangers from God's people, but through the blood of Christ, Ephesians 2 verse 13, they had drawn nigh or drawn near to Christ. Paul would talk about in that same set of verses that it was Jesus who broke down the wall of partition that separated Jew and Gentile and brought them together. And as verse 16 and 17 indicate, it was through Jesus, and it was through Jesus, his blood, that God had reconciled Jew and Gentile into one body. And that could be that's probably what's being taught about there in verse 32. The birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof, talking about how the church is a refuge to all peoples of the world. We'll talk about application when we get through of that of the mustard seed once we talk about the leaven, since it's so short. So again, we see the leaven. Verse 33 is where we see that in Matthew 13:33. Now I'll just go ahead and read that. I don't have it on the screen. But the kingdom of heaven is likened to leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till the whole was leavened. So we think about the term leaven, we think about it generally in a negative sense. Think about 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 through 7, where Paul's dealing with a man who's taken his father's wife and is essentially living in adultery. And Paul's point to the church in Corinth that had shown no distaste towards that individual, or really had shown no problem with that individual. Paul was making the statement that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump, or if you allow a little bit of sin in, that sin is going to constantly grow and become a problem within the church. The Jews often thought about leaven in a negative sense because you think about the Passover, which was a very important memorial that the Jews reflected on, looking back to the time when the angel of the Lord passed over their ancestors' houses in the land of Egypt for their salvation. That what was used in the Passover was unleavened bread, and so unleavened bread had special significance to them, and resulted in the idea that leaven would often be associated in a negative way. That's not necessarily the case here. When you read about the term leaven in verse 33, it's not talking about yeast, but it's talking about fermented dough. And the process that's being described here, the process that often happened when you made bread, is that you would use fermented dough, put that within other dough, and that would wind up making a batch of bread. But you would take some of that fermented dough and put it back, so that way later on when you had to make another batch, you would have fermented dough to put in there. And this was a common practice in the first century. Sometimes baking itself was a communal thing. The houses, think about living in a city. At that time, houses are small. Just like today, apartments in cities are often very small. And so sometimes baking was done as a communal thing. And in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 18, you read about how an entire family is in the process of baking in terms of from gathering the wood for the fire, starting the fire, and then kneading the dough and thus making the bread by putting it on the fire. And so sometimes baking was a communal thing. And this is brought out by the measure, the amount that's given here. It says that the woman takes the leaven and hid it in 3 measures of meal. And of course, we don't use measures as a term of measurement per se, like they did. When it says 3 measures of meal, it comes out to about 3 gallons. And this is probably describing a communal event where a woman's baking for it, because the amount of meal and the fermented dough within that would have come out to provide for about 100 to 150 people. So this is a great amount of bread that's being produced by really a small portion of leaven. And what the indication here is about this parable is that, growth begins on the inside. The fermented dough is put inside the meal in order for the bread to go, or for the bread to grow. And sometimes it might take time for that bread to develop. I've recently gotten the habit of making cookies and making them homemade. And so I put them in right away, and really the first 2 minutes you don't see much of a change. But if you come in about 8 to 10 minutes later, you see that the cookies rise. And that's sort of a quick process, but if you think about how much meal is being produced here, how much bread is being produced, this might take some time for the leaven to develop. And in a way, this is really explaining Christian growth. In part is what Jesus is trying to get here. For us as Christians, growth begins on the inside. It may take time to develop. And as we think about that, let's think about the application about the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven. When you're thinking about both of these, you want to think about the fact that we don't need to despise the work that a small group of people can do. Again, the mustard seed was one of the smallest seeds then, but it could grow into a pretty large and sizable tree. You think about John chapter 1, verses 40 and 41. It's by one individual, Andrew, who goes and finds his brother Peter and leads him to Christ. And we don't read about Andrew baptizing and preaching to a lot of people, but yet we read about Peter doing that over and over again in the book of Acts. And so that one simple act, that one simple individual, Andrew, while we might not think of him in great terms in terms of what the rest of the Bible said, if it's not for his actions, you don't have Peter. You don't have the growth of the church that's recorded in the book of Acts that comes from the work of Peter if you don't have Andrew at work. Matthew chapter 10, verse 42, Jesus talks about how just the simple act of giving 1 cup of water to one who is in need is considered a great thing in his eyes. A great thing in Jesus' eyes, because you're fulfilling Matthew chapter 25, providing for those that are hungered and thirst and things of that nature. That often can be one small act, but it can have a great impact on the person being helped. And we could think about this in terms of the church. You think about how many people maybe have the mindset that a smaller congregation isn't as good as a larger congregation because they don't have the potential to grow, or they don't have the potential to do good. And so some people look down on a smaller congregation because of their size, but what the parable of the mustard seed tells us is that a small group of people can do a lot of good works. Maybe if people more so had the mindset of that I don't have to be at a larger congregation in order to feel like I'm being productive for the Lord. I can be helpful to congregations that are small. It might be the case where you don't see so many congregations that are dying out, which is sort of happening in the present moment of the church. And so don't despise the work that a small group of people can do. And then as it pertains to the parable of the leaven, signs of growth are not always immediate. It takes time for the bread to cook. And the same way for Christians, it takes time sometimes. It takes time sometimes for us to recognize growth, not just in ourselves, but in the efforts of other individuals. In 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter's talking about the traits and the characteristics that Christians are to build and to add upon. And a lot of times that's very difficult to do. Some of those traits are harder than others to think about and to grow in, but he concludes in verse 8, for if these things be in you, these characteristics, if these things be in you and abound, they make you that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. So the focus is keep on growing. Keep on growing is what we need to think about in the parable of the leaven. Because that's what we should be doing as Christians, continuing to grow in the knowledge of the Word of God. And hopefully, when we grow as Christians, that results in our congregations and growing because we're willing to take the message to other people. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and stop here. Thank you for your time and attention. Again, I'll post on Facebook, just as a reminder, the text, and I'll make sure Dad gets that in the handout, the text to read for next week's Thursdays in the parables. But thank you all for your attention. I hope you have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you all on Sunday.